Okay, good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Let me have your attention. So, thank you for coming. It's going to be a very exciting time over the next 90 minutes. So, let me tell you about what we're going to do. All right. So, first, we're going to start off with a 14-minute short film. Well, not film, it's a YouTube video, it's an interview. All right. After the interview, we're going to be followed by a panel of distinguished scholars. All right. We have joined us today from UIC African American Studies Department, the great Professor Jane Rhodes. Our own great Professor Schwinn. And last but not least, a person who needs no introduction, the great Professor Cecil. So we expect a very good discussion for you all this morning. So following their brief remarks, I'll get into a couple of questions for the panel. And then after we explore some questions, we're going to open up the floor for you all to make any comments or present any questions that you would like, okay? And keep in mind, this is a safe space, all right? Everybody, there's no view or no voice, all right, that is not welcome, all right? We only ask that you be respectful and be professional, as this is a professional environment, okay? I want to thank, again, all of you for being here. I want to thank the decadal staff who was very supportive of this event, as well as the dean who couldn't be here today because she's away traveling. I could not also have done this. Is Professor Lasso here? Professor Lasso, let's give him a round of applause. Professor Lasso chairs our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And when he heard that we really didn't have a budget for this, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to give them some pizza. I'm going to find the cheapest pizza I can possibly find. You all know, my former students, you all know me. Cheap pizza is the way to go. Right? And he says, no. He called his friends, and he went in with me and came out of his own pocket to pay half of this and for you all to have something to eat. So that's the kind of dedication that you have. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started before we run out of time. And the event is being recorded for those of us who could not.
Today, the New York Times published the print edition of the 1619 Project. The name marks this month's 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved people brought from Africa to the then Virginia colony. The Times says the project aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The project is led by New York Times Magazine reporter Nicole Jones, who is the author of the opening essay. She joins me now. You have been working on this for a number of years, but you put this together very quickly. First of all, why? Why this topic? Why this issue?
Well, you don't have very many opportunities to ever celebrate the 400th anniversary of anything. And it seemed to me that this was a great opportunity to really, as you said in your opening, reframe the way that we have thought about an institution that has impacted almost everything in modern American society, but that we're taught very little about, that we're often taught as marginal to the American story. And we wanted to do something different. We wanted to use the platform of the Times to force us to confront the reality of what slavery has meant for our development as a nation.
And this isn't just about sort of the kind of textbook ideas of what happened to slaves. You've got essays in here about healthcare, about geography, about sugar, about music, all of these different ripple effects that happen throughout the economy, and really life here. You said in a sentence, you said, we would not be the United States were it not for slavery. This is kind of one of the original fibers that made this country.
Absolutely. The conceit of the magazine is that one of the things we hear all the time is, well, that was in the past. Why do you have to keep talking about the past? Well, one, I think the past is clearly instructive for how we are right now. But also, the conceit of the magazine is that you can look at all of these modern phenomena that you think are unrelated to slavery at all, and we were going to show you how they are. And so we have a story in there about traffic patterns. We have a story about why we're the only Western industrial country without universal health care, about why Americans consume so much sugar, about capitalism, about democracy. We're really trying to change the way that Americans are thinking, that this was just a problem of the past that we've resolved, and show that it isn't. What many people don't know, and I point this out in my essay, is that one of the reasons we even decide to become a nation in the first place is over the issue of slavery. And had we not had slavery, we might be Canada. That one of the reasons that the founders wanted to break off from Britain is they were afraid that Britain was going to begin regulating slavery and maybe even moving towards abolishment. And we were making so much money off of slavery that the founders wanted to be able to continue it. We're not taught that when we're taught about our origin stories. And not knowing that then really does not allow us to grapple with the nation that we really are, and not just the nation that we're taught in kind of American mythology.
And that money ends up fueling so much more of what made this country.
Of course. It's not incidental that 10 of the first 12 presidents of the United States were slave owners. This is where, at that time, this kind of very burgeoning nation was getting so much of its wealth and its power. It's what allowed this kind of ragged group of colonists to believe that they could defeat the most powerful empire in the world at that time. And it went everywhere. It was north and south. We talk about the Industrial Revolution. Where do Americans believe that the cotton that was being spun in those textile mills coming from? Coming from enslaved people who were growing that cotton in the South. The rum industry, rum was the currency of the slave trade. That rum was being processed and sold in the United States. The banking industry that rises in New York City is rising largely to provide the mortgages and insurance policies that to finance the slave trade. The shipbuilders, our northern shipbuilders, the people who are sending voyages to Africa to bring enslaved people here, are all in the north. So this was a truly national enterprise. But we prefer to think that it was just some backward Southerners, because that is the way that we can kind of deal with our fundamental paradox at our beginning, that we were a nation built on both the inalienable rights of man and also a nation built on bondage.
Yeah, and you even talk about Wall Street's name comes from something that most of us don't recognize.
Absolutely. So Wall Street is called Wall Street because it was on that wall that enslaved people were bought and sold. That's been completely erased from our national memory and completely erased from the way that we think about the North. At the time of the Civil War, New York City's mayor actually threatened to secede from the Union with the South because so much money was being made off of slave-produced cotton that was being exported out of New York City. It is that erasure, I think, that has prevented us from really grappling with our history and so much in modern society that we see that is still related to that.
You know, one of the essays in here about healthcare, which is fascinating, is that some of the myths that started then are still perpetuated today in modern healthcare, and that there are still gross misunderstandings of that could actually have very serious health consequences.
Absolutely. So Linda Villarosa has this compelling essay that talks about how during slavery, enslavers were using enslaved people to do these medical experiments. But also we were using medical technology to justify slavery by saying enslaved people don't feel pain the way, or people of African descent don't feel pain the way that white people do. That they have thicker skin, and so you can beat them or torture them and it's not going to hurt as bad. Well, these are all justifications for slavery. But if you look at modern medical science and our understanding, they're still using these calculations that say lung capacity was one of the things that Linda writes about, that black people have worse lung capacity. And the reason enslavers said that was they said that working in the fields and doing this hard labor was good for black people because it helped them increase their lung capacity. Well, what Linda points out is today, doctors and medical science are still accounting for what they think is a lessened lung capacity of black Americans. And it's simply not true. But we've never purged ourselves of that false science that was used to justify racism.
You talk about basically that the black American, or just the black experience, has been inconvenient to the narrative of this nation in all of these different categories, that it's been something that we have struggled to deal with, but oftentimes just not dealt with it as a result, that it was thorny.
Absolutely. So when you think about the story of who we are, that we are this country built on individual rights. We are the country where if you are coming from a place where you are not free, you can come to our shores and you can get freedom. Well, then you have Black people, and every time you look at Black Americans, you have to be reminded that there was 1/5 of our population who had no rights, no liberties, no freedom whatsoever. We are the constant reminder of really the lie at our origins, that while Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, his enslaved brother-in-law was there to serve him and make sure that he's comfortable. So I think this explains a lot. The continued perception that Black people are a problem, that Black people are, as Abraham Lincoln said, a troublesome presence in American democracy, because every time you see us, you have to be reminded of our original sin. And no one wants to be reminded of sin. We're ashamed of sin.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned a couple of nights ago when this project launched is the story of your grandmother who grew up a sharecropper. And here you are today. She didn't live to be able to see this magazine, but I'm assuming she'd be proud.
Yeah, I think she would. My grandmother died when I was still in college, and she would be astounded to see what I became. And I think that that's an important part of this story. We hear all the time what people consider the problems of the quote-unquote Black community. And people like to point out statistics that they think are indicative of Black failure. But when we think that, as I point out in the magazine, I'm part of the first generation of Black Americans in the history of this country who was born into a country where it was not legal to discriminate against me just because I descended from people from Africa, we made tremendous progress in a very short period of time. Really just 1 or 2 generations out of legal Jim Crow, you can have someone like me at the New York Times producing this work. And it really is a story of Black ascension once the legal barriers have been removed.
You talk in eloquent terms about how Black people were really the perfecters of this democracy, that we had these original documents, but really it took this all the way almost to the civil rights struggle for us to start seeing what those words actually meant.
Absolutely. What I argue is that no one values freedom more than those who never had it. And so while the founders were writing these lofty and aspirational words, even as they knew that they were going to continue a system of slavery, Black people had no choice but to believe in the literal interpretation of those words, that all men are created equal and are born with inalienable rights. And so Black people, really from the moment we landed on these shores, have been resisting and trying to push the society toward a more equal society of universal rights. And that has really been our role. You can look at the fact that Black people have fought in every single war this country has ever fought, but we've also engaged in a 250-year internal war against our own country to try to force our country to also bring full democracy here and not just abroad.
Okay, this magazine is also showing up in 2019 in a climate where, at this point, all you have to do is just look at your Twitter feed, look at the hashtag, and you see people who have an incredibly different narrative that they believe very strongly, that they look at this magazine, the Times, everything else as part of a larger propaganda campaign, as part of a conspiracy, etc. How do you deal with that?
There's 2 things that I would say to that. Every piece in here is deeply researched. It is backed up by historical evidence. Our fact checkers went back to panels of historians and had them go through every single argument and every single fact that is in here. So it's really not something that you can dispute with facts. But the other thing is if we truly understand that Black people are fully American, and so the struggle of Black people to make our union actually reflect its values is not a negative thing against the country, because we are citizens who are working to make this country better for all Americans. That is something that white Americans, if they really believe, as they say, that race doesn't matter, we're all Americans, should also be proud of, embrace that story. We cannot deny our past, and if you believe that 1776 matters, if you believe that our Constitution still matters, then you also have to understand that the legacy of slavery still matters. And you can't pick and choose what parts of history we think are important and which ones are. They all are important. And that narrative that is inclusive and honest, even if it's painful, is the only way that we can understand our times now and the only way we can move forward. I think if people read, for instance, the story on why we don't have universal health care, What it shows is that racism doesn't just hurt black people, but there are millions of white people in this country who are dying, who are sick, who are unable to pay their medical bills because we can't get past the legacy of slavery. This affects all Americans, no matter if you just got here yesterday, if your family's been here 200 years, no matter what your race are. Our inability to deal with this original sin is hurting all of us, and this entire country is not the country that it could be because of it.
So just connect that dot. What is the connection between universal health care and slavery?
Well, what we know is that white support for universal programs declines if they think that large numbers of black people are going to benefit from it. And this is a sentiment that goes all the way back to right after the end of the Civil War, when the Freedmen's Bureau starts to offer universal health care for people who had literally just come out of bondage, had not a dollar to their name, had nowhere to live, had nothing. And white people immediately pushed back against that, believing that even people who had just come out of slavery should not get anything, quote unquote, for free. Even though their labor clearly had built the entire, most of the economy of the country. And so that sentiment continues to this day. And if you look at across Western industrialized nations, European nations, we have the stingiest social safety net of all of those nations. And it's because we are the only one on whose land we practice slavery. So our inability to get past that is hurting. It's not just in terms of universal health care, but you can look at why we don't have universal child care, why we have the stingiest parental leave, why we have lowest ability to have people represented by unions. All of this goes back to the sentiment that if black people are going to benefit, white Americans will not support it. Large numbers of white Americans.
So this is the actual physical edition that a lot of people in the country might not be able to get if they don't have a newsstand that sells the New York Times. But it's also, all of it is online, right? All the essays are online, and this was a special section. This was in partnership with the Smithsonian?
Yes.
Right? And so you've got curriculum that's online, you've got all of the New York Times magazine that's online. You're doing a lot of different kinds of outreach projects. Right after this, you're going to a 1619 brunch.
Yes.
And this is happening in different parts of the country as well?
Yeah, so people all across the country are holding brunches to really sit and discuss this, which is more than my wildest dreams for this project. I think just because of what's happening in the country right now, people are really searching for answers. We've raised money so that we could print more than 200,000 additional copies that we are distributing in various places across the country for free, because we really want not just Times subscribers to get access to this, but communities where it's difficult to get the Times, where people can't afford to get the Times. We truly think that this is a public service project that is important for all Americans, not just our subscribers, to get access to.
Nicole Hannah-Jones, thank you so much.
Thank you.
400 years ago this month, in 1619, 20 enslaved Africans arrived at what would become the United States. Ironically, a place called Point Comfort in the British colony of Virginia.
So you would think after so many years of being up here, I would know what I was doing, right? Okay, so now we'll start our panel discussion, and we're going to start off with Professor Rhodes, followed by Professor Schwinn, and then Professor Hunt.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I'm delighted to be here. I think this is the first time I've set foot in this building. I'm really pleased to be part of the community, the academic and intellectual community with John Marshall Law School. And I invite all of you down to the main UIC campus to continue the conversation. I want to thank Professor Jones in particular for inviting me and organizing this. This is a project that has to continue to happen, and scholars and students like yourselves are key people, key participants in this endeavor. So let's all agree that we'll keep this conversation going. Okay. I have a couple of sort of reactions that I want to talk about first, and more sort of both personal and intellectual reflections. I'm just going to give a little bit of a breakdown on some key aspects of the history of slavery. I did not really read or study or know much about slavery until I was almost 30 years old. I'm just as a question here, how many people in this room took a class or more than a class about African American history or the history of slavery or the history of ethnic studies? Awesome. Okay. Awesome. That is foundational. That's critical. Nicole Hannah Jones rather is a rock star and my idol. And part of the reason why she is because in the very beginning of her video, she emphasizes the fact that race is a fundamental organizing characteristic and structure of American society. Okay, it structures our economy, it structures our political system, it structures our intellectual work, it structures virtually everything. But if you don't study it, if you don't get some access to it, if you don't read about it, if you haven't been exposed to that history, you're not going to know it, right? And we know that ignorance flourishes in those gaps where we have no access to history and historical knowledge. So one of the things that I think is really critical and that we try to do in our department and across the campus at UIC is to fill those gaps and also to train secondary school teachers and others who can then deliver that information. So I'm expecting you all and your own professional aspirations to take up that mantle as well, because there's going to be lots of opportunities and needs for every single person in this room to carry on that tradition. Just a couple of things about me, since you all don't know me, you know these other folks, but you don't know me. I, as I noted, didn't take a course on the history of slavery until I was a graduate student. And that was a failure of my education. I took one Black literature course as an undergraduate to fill an English requirement, and then I went off because I thought I was going to go to medical school and I was taking all of these science courses. And I find this a lot among my own students who think that you don't have to actually study, you don't have to have knowledge, you don't have to learn, right? Many African American students say, oh, I don't need a class, I've lived it. And I say, immediately, you're wrong. This is a field of inquiry. It is books and studies and scholarship and historical evidence that we all have to imbibe. So my scholarship, my first book was on, and my dissertation was on the abolitionist movement, and we can talk later about sort of Black resistance if you want to. But I wanted to spend just a few moments talking about the knowledge that Black people in particular contributed to, and to think about that in the context of what she's talking about, which is the ways that we've ignored slavery, or we deflect it, or we say that it doesn't matter. Obviously, I thoroughly agree with her that one of the reasons why people say it doesn't matter is because it's painful. It's psychologically difficult to deal with this kind of dissonant issue. There's a sense of blame, there's a sense of shame, but that's all the more reason that we need to really engage with this process and to fight against this sort of lack of education or miseducation around race, racial hierarchy, white supremacy, and social structures. All right, I'll stop preaching. I could do that for my entire time. I'm going to move on to talking about some key markers in the history of slavery. First and foremost, the story of slavery, telling the story, was initiated very often by Black people themselves, Black people who were in the midst of slavery, and we don't often recognize that. Slavery operated with a complex interplay of economic need and expediency, the emergence of theories about human diversity that had its origins in religion, and the rise of Enlightenment thinking, and a pattern of settler colonialism that rationalized genocide, subjugation, and cruel treatment as necessary for the growth of empire. Okay, and if you haven't heard that term settler colonialism before, that is a sort of foundational notion in which the colonizer is justified in claiming and capturing bodies and land and cultures for both economic gain and for survival. So Black people were the objects and also the observers, and really provided the foundation. So the history that appears, and I have another copy of the 1619 edition, can start with somebody like Olaudah Equiana, who some of you may have heard of, who traveled from his home in modern-day Nigeria in the late 18th century, was enslaved as a child. He was liberated by working in the Royal Navy, and then he became an influential abolitionist in Europe. He published a book in 1789. This is a black man from what was called Guinea then, Nigeria today. A black man called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiana. And so we've had his story and many others for 300 years. And we still claim that we don't know about slavery and we don't have to really face the realities of slavery. His book revealed the horrors and degradation of slavery to audiences that either deflected or ignored it or simply had no contact with the institution. He also provided a rich and nuanced view of the life and culture of his native land, which is critically important. So if we're looking at an ideology that justifies slavery by saying that Africa is uncivilized, that Africans do not have the same moral capacity, that they do not have the same intellectual capacity, and that they don't have the same humanity as Europeans, and that is the sort of foundational rationale. What happens when a person writes a book, a narrative that refutes that shows the rich history and culture of Africa? And he very much disrupted the notions of Africans as primitive savages. And I wanted to just read you a quote in which he talks about being in the Middle Passage. He's on a slave ship, having been captured as a child. He said, quote, "I was not long suffered to indulge my grief. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the lonesomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, a windlass and tied my feet while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it, yet nevertheless I could not get over to the nettings, or I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely who were not chained down to the decks, lest we leap into the water. And I have seen some of those poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating." So the first time I read that, I had nightmares. I felt a gut punch, as some of you may be feeling now if you've never heard slave narratives before. That is the history of slavery. That is the eyewitness account of someone who was enslaved. And that is the sort of personal, but also the sort of institutional and systematic environment in which the first African Americans encountered. We know that there's a whole stack of 19th century slave narratives. Many of you perhaps read some of Frederick Douglass's narrative in high school or college. But Sojourner Truth and Harriet Jacobs and dozens others wrote their story so that people could see, could explain, could encounter, could somehow feel this experience that had been limited to the Black experience. These slave narratives were a strategic tool. They were designed to organize people, to mobilize, to get people angry, to get people saddened, to get people to act. And they are also critical contributions to our historical knowledge that create sort of an alternative to this idea that slavery was sort of a benevolent institution and was necessary for the maintenance of our social and economic order. So we know that during slavery, key intellectual figures and political leaders like Thomas Jefferson provided a very different argument. Thomas Jefferson, one of those 21 founding presidents who owned slaves, one of the founding fathers, wrote a very important book called The Notes on the State of Virginia. And in that, the core of his argument was that there was fundamental differences between black and white that meant that the races could never survive together. And so Jefferson is sort of emblematic of the history and legacy of slavery in the United States because Thomas Jefferson, as many of you know, had a long-term relationship with a black woman, had children with her, raised a family with her. The woman, Sally Hemings, who was his common-law wife, was actually related to his actually married wife. We now know that there are descendants of the black side of the Jefferson family. For hundreds of years, the Jeffersons ignored and refuted this knowledge, and it wasn't until historians came along and actually did the historical record and found out the evidence of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' family that we now know that this was the reality of Thomas Jefferson's life. So think about the psychological gymnastics that you have to go through to argue persuasively that black people are subhuman, that black people are not like white people, that you have to keep the separated, the races separated at the same time that you are building a family together, right? And and Sally Hemings traveled with him to France. I mean, it is very much symbolic of the sort of condition, the mental and psychological and social condition of slavery. In the aftermath of the Civil War, I could go on about that. I'm just going to skip ahead and give you a couple more examples before I wrap up. In the aftermath of the Civil War, we see the rise of racial science, which this issue mentions, which provides a continued justification for the oppression and subjugation of people. And many of these people are celebrated. Louis Agassiz was a botanist from Belgium. There is an entire museum at Harvard University that he endowed that's named after him. And he said that the whole country was indebted to whiteness, that black people were deficient, and that he was going to be a leader of scientific knowledge to prove the ways in which there was racial hierarchies between black and white and everything in between. I'm going to skip ahead as I wrap up because I want to get us from racial science and eugenics to the critical interventions of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, many of you may have encountered Du Bois, maybe his Souls of Black Folk or other texts, but many people don't know that Du Bois's dissertation, written at Harvard University in 1896, was titled The Suppression of the African Slave Trade. He wrote one of the very first studies that argued that the slave trade flourished under the guise of its suppression. He wrote it functioned legally for 20 years following the compromise of the Federal Convention of 1787, and illegally for another half century. So in other words, while out of the mouths of the writers of the Constitution, they were saying they were suppressing the slave trade, they were going to end it, they kept it going for economic gain. And Du Bois mapped the government's slow movement towards abolition while providing a litany of the failures, missed opportunities, and belated acts that kept black people enslaved. Du Bois is one of the founding fathers of the history of slavery. People don't give him credit for that. What we do know is that what emerges is historians who go through a lot of work to talk about slavery as a benevolent institution. Throughout the early 20th century, many of the most famous historians argued that it really wasn't that bad, that slave owners were not abusive, and that it was a necessary part of the building of the American economy. I'll finish with one other sort of key founding father of the history of slavery, another brilliant black scholar, John Hope Franklin. Some of you, when you took that African American history class in college, might have used his celebrated textbook, From Slavery to Freedom. And John Hope Franklin, among other things, was the first black tenured professor at the University of Chicago in history. And he wrote a very important text called The Militant South in 1956, in which he explained the foundations of Southern resistance and the structure of society based on race. And if you'll bear with me, I just want to read you a short excerpt from this study, because it sounds very familiar to today. He said, "Slavery strengthened the military tradition in the South because owners found it desirable, even necessary, to build up a fighting force to keep the slaves under control. They also felt compelled to oppose outside attacks within a military defense. They regarded the abolitionist attack as a war on their institutions." You've heard that rhetoric recently. They read anti-slavery literature, observed the establishment of organizations dedicated to the destruction of slavery, and felt the sting of subversive activities like the Underground Railroad. And Southerners reasoned that they were the targets of an all-out offensive war. Okay, think about that. They're the ones that saw themselves as being victims and under attack. The successful defense of slavery, whether by argument or by force, depended on the development of a powerful justification based on race superiority that would bring to its support all or almost all white elements in the South. So they redefined the facts of history, the teachings of the Bible, and the principles of economics, all in the defense of slavery. So today's allegations about alternative facts and the claims of false news are all part of this historical legacy of distorting and rewriting history in order to support the continued oppression, subjugation, discrimination against different racial groups. So we need to read our history. We need to expand our knowledge so that we can be better equipped to deal with this, to fight it, and to move the nation forward. Okay, thanks very much, and I'll be happy to engage in more conversation later.
Professor Schwinn.
Thank you. That's going to be tough to follow. I want to thank you, Professor Jones, Dr. Rhodes, Professor Hunt. This is beyond an honor to be a part of this very important, vital panel and this really important discussion that we're having today. And thank you all for coming today. It's really encouraging to see the number of students show up. Many of my current students, many of my former students I'm glad to see, and to know that the student body here supports this kind of programming is, I think, important and a testament to the commitment that we have here at John Marshall, University of Illinois, Chicago, and this union. Dr. Rhodes' talk just reminds me about how excited I am to be a part of the University of Chicago and the opportunities that we all have to explore these issues from an interdisciplinary approach, and to look at issues like slavery today from a variety of different perspectives, which is so important for us as developing lawyers. As I was preparing for today, I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution. And I remembered that Professor Hunt and I led a delegation of students many years ago, right, to South Africa to look at a very different system of racial dynamics. Shared a lot in common, to be sure, with the United States, but very different in its own way, and dealing with it very differently. So when we hear about how we're dealing with issues today of race relations that directly trace to our ugly history of slavery, we can look to a place like South Africa and we can see a different kind of model. We might be doing this differently, right? We might be doing it differently. And just a quick plug, I'll be offering a seminar in the spring that's going to be looking at some of the health disparities in Chicago by race, by zip code, that relate directly to some of the things that we heard about. So if you're interested in that, we can continue this discussion there. But I do want to talk about the Constitution. Our Constitution is this on? No? We're just going to dispense with it then. So our Constitution is famously pro-slavery. It's got the 3/5 clause, right, that we all know about it. Protects the Atlantic slave trade until 1808 and authorizes Congress to do away with it after that, but as we've heard, Congress did no such thing. It has the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause. It also has equal representation in the United States Senate and a number of other structural features in the document that are designed to protect and preserve this institution of slavery. But here's the thing. You can look that document up and down, do a word search, read it 100 times, and in the 1787 Constitution, you will not find the word slavery. It doesn't appear in our constitutional history until the 13th Amendment, when we banned slavery, much later than 1787. And moreover, in the 1787 Constitution, you won't find a reference to property in humans, which is interesting and important. This is not just a subterfuge. The historical evidence suggests that the framers were writing a constitution that on the one hand acknowledged this institution and preserved it in important ways. It's really important to acknowledge that. It's a pro-slavery constitution. But on the other hand, they also built in features that could, if activated, could lead to slavery's demise. And they were well aware of that. So this led to a fierce debate in the 19th century between people that read the Constitution as a pro-slavery document and people that read the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. On the pro-slavery side, you had a kind of weird coming together of very strange bedfellows. You had William Lloyd Garrison joining forces with John Calhoun, right? Famous abolitionist with a famous Southern theorist about states' rights and property in humans and slavery, coming together to say this is a pro-slavery document. On the other side, on the anti-slavery side, you had figures like Frederick Douglass, at least later in his life, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and a bunch of other people saying, no, this is an anti-slavery document. Some recent scholarship suggests, and we can talk about this if you're interested, it's not uncontroversial, but suggests that the framers also deliberately did not put in this idea of slavery as property in humans into the 1787 Constitution with an eye toward doing away, at least at some point in the future, doing away with this evil institution. So what we see is a kind of debate from a constitution that, by one reckoning, is a anti-slavery document, by another reckoning is a pro-slavery document. But the Supreme Court puts a quick stop to that in 1857 in the Dred Scott case, when the Supreme Court says definitively, for the court at least, that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document and overturns the Missouri Compromise and actually writes into the opinion that the Constitution does protect property in humans, that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. Now remember what I told you a second ago. The Constitution doesn't use the word slavery. It doesn't protect, by its terms, property in humans. And here you have the Supreme Court coming along in the mid-19th century saying, oh yeah, it does. It does. Chief Justice Taney did a real disservice and kind of set us on the course of a constitutional history dealing with slavery and race relations, where we consistently are taking, in many ways, 2 steps forward and 1 or even 1.5 steps back. So we see that again after the Civil War. We see Congress enact and we enact the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? We see Congress embark on an aggressive strategy of Reconstruction in the South. We see Congress enact the Civil Rights Act based on its authority in the 13th and 14th Amendments, the same members of Congress who ratified the 13th and 14th Amendments, so we kind of presume that they know what they're talking about. 2 steps forward. But then very quickly we see the Supreme Court rule in the slaughterhouse cases, that Congress's authority under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments isn't nearly as expansive as Congress itself thought that it was. We see the Supreme Court very quickly rule in the civil rights cases the same thing. Congress's authority under the 13th and 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court said, doesn't actually mean what Congress thought it meant. It means something much narrower, right? In the civil rights cases. We see Plessy versus Ferguson later in the 19th century saying the 14th Amendment command for equal protection, that means separate but equal. Separate but equal is going to pass muster in Plessy versus Ferguson. Now that's a little bit of a shocker, isn't it, to those who wrote the 14th Amendment. Then we see things like the Black Codes, right? How many people know what the Black Codes are? Okay, I'm always a little surprised when I ask this in class how many people don't, and it goes to the point about history. We gotta know this stuff, right? The Black Codes are state laws in the South, primarily in the South, that keep freed blacks in a kind of de facto condition of slavery, right? They prevent contracting, they prevent property ownership, they prevent blacks' ability to go to court. All these things that we take for granted, well, as we'll see in a second, maybe don't take so much for granted today. But all these things that we ought to take for granted today in a free and democratic society, these are things that allow us to exercise our democratic rights. And the Black Codes systematically took them away from free blacks in the South, keeping them in a condition of de facto slavery. We saw President Johnson, who rolled back Reconstruction, right? And vetoed early civil rights acts when then Congress overrode those vetoes. 2 steps forward, 1 or 1.5 steps back. And then when we go forward in history, we see this trend again. We see in 1954, the Supreme Court overturns Plessy versus Ferguson after, and this story is just fascinating, decades of strategic litigation led by the NAACP and other equality instigators to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Finally, they get the case. Finally, they get the case in Brown versus Board of Education that tees it up, and they get a unanimous Supreme Court ruling saying separate is inherently unequal, right? 2 steps forward. And then, later, the next decade, Congress enacts the Civil Rights Act of 1964, path-breaking legislation. But you know what? Congress had to enact it pursuant to its Commerce Clause authority. What? Not its 14th Amendment authority, because remember, the Supreme Court restricted what equal protection means in the civil rights cases. Still, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have the Fair Housing Act. We have a number of other civil rights acts. We're moving in the right direction, 2 steps forward, right? But then the Supreme Court gets a hold of this, and what does the Supreme Court do? Through its desegregation decisions, through its affirmative action decisions, through its technical, structural state action doctrine decisions, the Supreme Court cuts away at our ability to litigate under the Equal Protection Clause, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, leading to cases like, most recently, Parents Involved, dealing with desegregation, right? And cities and localities' ability to adopt measures that are based on race to overcome an ugly history of segregation in the schools. And we see a recent case from 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, where the Supreme Court, get the gall here, the Supreme Court effectively overturns the crown jewel, not just of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but of the civil rights era. The requirement for pre-clearance of voting changes for covered jurisdictions in the South. This is just breathtaking. 2 steps forward, 1 or even 1.5 steps back. Now here's the thing. Our Constitution allows us to take those 2 steps forward. That's the good news. The bad news is it also allows us to take those 1.5 steps back. The thing is, the way the Constitution is designed, that 1.5 steps back, if you just look historically, often that's engineered by a majority in our society, right? But often it's engineered by a minority in our society. I'm not talking about a racial minority. I'm talking about an ideological minority, engineering that 1.5 step back in terms of protecting and advancing civil rights and equality in our society. And this is what I like to tell my students. If our Constitution gives us a choice, as it does, to take 2 steps forward or 1 step back, and we've seen over history, we've seen judges, we've seen activists, we've seen attorneys, we've seen scholars moving 2 steps forward, and others moving 1 or 1.5 steps back. Here's what I like to tell my students. If they can do it, so can you. Take those 2 steps forward. Use your career and the power that you get when you get that JD diploma to go out in the world and move us 2 steps forward. Thank you.
Professor Hunt.
I too am honored to be here among you. And I'm very pleased to see that we have a packed house. And I'm even more pleased to see that it is a highly integrated house. There have always been white allies in favor of civil rights for black people. We talk a lot about abolitions. Before we get too carried away with abolitions, we should also remember that not only were they anti-slavery, but they were anti-equality as well. They thought slavery was a sin, but they did not think that black slaves, Africans, were equal socially, politically, economically to white people. So a lot of people who strive and get involved, white people who get involved in the civil rights movement, are the same. They don't think that black people are equal. They think they're being treated badly, but not that they're equal. In fact, the 1954 civil rights decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which was a unanimous decision striking down segregation in public schools, was not about largesse of white people, not about the sense that they had realized that somehow segregated schools was a bad thing. This is right after World War II, when a lot of former colonies in Africa and Latin America, South America, were throwing off their colonial masters. And America was in a big competition with Russia in order to extend its sphere of influence on these newly freed colonial countries. Many of which, most of which, were filled with people of color. And so it was very difficult for the United States to say, come and be with us and be part of the American sphere of influence in the world, when the Russians would say, look how they treat their black people. You are black people. You are brown people. Look what they do in America to people who look like you. So it was an imperative, Cold War imperative, in order to be on the same footing with Russia, that motivated the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education to eliminate segregation in schools. Not because white people had become enlightened, but because they realized that from a political standpoint, they could not make the argument of newly freed colonies to come and be part of the American sphere of influence against the Russians, who said, oh yeah, look what they do. Don't look at what they say, look at what they do. Now the title of my project is Feeding the Profit Machine. Dignity and the commodification of black bodies from slavery to mass incarceration. There's no question that today, the United States is an economic and political colossus in the world. It stands astride the world and heralds itself as the land of the free, the home of the brave, the land of opportunity. Well, we know that that has never been true. America has never been the land of the free. It's been the land of the unfree. It's never been the land of home of the brave. It's been a home of those who were too cowardly to stand up against that which they knew was morally wrong. So from the arrival of the first African slaves in British North America, 1619, and right up to today's era of racialized mass incarceration, millions of black and brown bodies have been commodified as ordinary articles of merchandise. Now that statement, that characterization of black bodies as ordinary articles of merchandise, a theory that was accepted universally, says Justice Taney and Dred Scott, was the United States Supreme Court acknowledging that slavery was constitutional because black people were not intended to be part of the Constitution as citizens. Instead, they were ordinary articles of merchandise to be bought and sold whenever a profit could be had. Now, up until recently, traditional historical narratives of the creation of the American global dominance has emphasized the ingenuity, creative genius, and perseverance and grit of white Europeans that settled this country as key elements that gave rise to the modern American state. None of that is true. That's the traditional American narrative. The story of legal enslavement of a substantial segment of the population rarely figured into this national narrative. Since the late summer of 1619, the commodification of black bodies has always been in service of massive white profits and wealth and a booming national and global economy for white profit. As was mentioned by Jane in her comments, the cotton that was spun to make cloth in England, in India, in the northeast part of America, was cotton that had been picked by slaves in the South. In fact, just prior to the Civil War, the greatest, number one, far and away, the greatest economic property owned in the United States, greater than railroads, greater than stock market and business, combined, was the value in slaves. And that's why the South fought so hard. Because they knew without slavery, the South could not exist as they knew it. It could not exist. And a lot of people will tell you, and maybe you learned this in school, that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a white fantasy. That somehow it has something to do with something else. My son was taught that in school. And he came home one day and told me that. I was out. I went to his school and went to his history teacher and said, "Are you teaching these kids this?" And he said, oh yes, slavery. I said, then what was at stake? What was the cause of the Civil War? Oh, tariffs. Tariffs. 1 million people died for tariffs. Tariffs on what? Cotton. Cotton. The Vice President of the Confederate States, upon the creation of the Federal States, gave a speech called the Cornerstone Speech. And he said the Confederate States are created and established on the universal truth of black inferiority and white supremacy, which of course was the justification for slavery. It is dedicated to this cause. So it's not me who's saying that Civil War was based on slavery. It's the Vice President of the Confederacy saying this at the time. It was all about slavery. And the slaves knew it. That if the Union Army came south and defeated the Southern Army, first things they would do was abolish slavery. Now, in the Revolutionary War, 1/5 1 in 20 revolutionary colonial soldiers was black. We've been in every war America's ever had. They were promised freedom. And the Frenchman Lafayette, who helped save America, without French support, there would have been no America. And you talk about American fries, right? And French rifles only dropped once. Without the French and the support of Lafayette and the king, there would have been no America. He persuaded, along with Benjamin Franklin, the King of France to send troops, actual physical troops, to help the American colonial army, and the French Navy to help the colonial American Navy. And at Yorktown, which was the pivotal loss of the British troops, the colonial troops had surrounded the British at Yorktown. They thought the British Navy was going to sail up to the back of Yorktown and rescue them and evacuate them. Instead of the British Navy coming to evacuate them, the French Navy came, pushed the British Navy aside, surrounded Yorktown, and now Yorktown was completely surrounded. No escape. The French Navy and the British colonial troops. He later said, as he was involved in the French Revolution, if I had known that I was fighting for a slave country, I would never have gone. I would never have participated. All that talk about freedom. The original Constitution, as written by Jefferson, talked a lot about freedom and slavery from the British monarch. That the British monarch was treating the colonials like slaves. And they were fighting for their freedom from monarchical rule from Britain. And when he submitted that draft, the framers said, oh, no, we can't do that. We can't talk about slavery and our victimization by the British treating us as slaves when we have slaves. Jane talked about the number of people who were colonial fathers, founding fathers, who owned slaves. Virtually every single person who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson came to the convention saying, I own 200 slaves. That was status. He was proud of that. And other people deferred to him because he owned 200 slaves. And as she points out, he had 5 sons from Sally Hemings, which was basically a half-sister to his wife, who had died. So obviously she looked a little bit like her. And he had only 1 child, which was a daughter. But he had 5 sons from Sally Hemings. Her first child by Jefferson was when she was 13 years old. What do we call that today? When adult men have sex with and produce children from 13-year-old girls. We call that pedophilia. Right? Can we listen to Michael Jackson anymore? Because he's a pedophile. If we can't listen to Michael Jackson anymore, we can't read the Declaration of Independence anymore. And they say, as was pointed out, this was a long time ago. It has nothing to do with today. Get over it. Right? Get over it. A lifetime in America is about 70 years. 2 lifetimes ago, 140, 150 years ago, there were slaves. There were slaves. 2 lifetimes. 2 lifetimes. That's how close we are. Now, if you don't want us to talk about slavery, because it was too long ago and ended in 1865, supposedly, with the 13th Amendment. Okay, we'll stop talking about slavery if you stop talking about Robert E. Lee, because they were coterminous. If you stop talking about Stonewall Jackson and the Confederate Army, and there are statues all over the country, and especially in the South. That's what started Charlottesville, because there was a statue of Robert E. Lee on horseback on a huge pedestal. It was gigantic. And people came there and said, we got to get rid of this. It's on public land, paid for with tax dollars, celebrating the Confederacy. Now, if you engaged in armed combat to overthrow the United States government, what is that called? That's called treason. That's called treason. Robert E. Lee was a traitor. One day he's commandant of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Ironically enough, so was Benedict Arnold. So that's not such a great credential. But Lincoln called him in and said, all right, they have seceded. I want you to take control of the entire Union Army and put down this rebellion. And he was like the best soldier in the Union Army. When John Brown went to Harper's Ferry to revolt, hoping to encourage the slaves to revolt against slavery, it didn't work out. But who came to put down that rebellion? Robert E. Lee, as a colonel in the U.S. Army, the #1 officer in the United States. So what did he say to Lincoln? I got to think about that. Now, if you propose to somebody, and they tell you, well, I got to think about it. That's a no. That's a no. What's there to think about? It's yes or no. Well, give me the night to sleep on. I'll get back to you. That's a no. So Robert E. Lee went back to Mount Vernon and went back to where his house was at Arlington, which is now Arlington National Cemetery. Thought about it over the weekend, took off his Union uniform, put on a Confederate uniform, and came back and told Lincoln, no, not only am I not going to command the United States forces, I'm going to command the Confederate forces. That's treason. And treason is punishable by death. If we had done it the right way after the Civil War ended and they lost, we should have hung Robert E. Lee and all those other leaders of the Confederate Army. They have a saying, you shoot at the king, you better not miss, because you only get one shot. And after that one shot, you get hung. The leaders of the rebellion are executed. Robert E. Lee was indicted. They were going to hang him. Ulysses Grant intervened. We can't do that. If we hang Robert E. Lee, then most Confederate soldiers will not surrender. They worship him. They will stay in the woods. They will stay in the hills. And we will have a guerrilla war for a generation. We cannot kill him. But if it was up to me, he'd have been hung in public. And we'd have had a guerrilla war for a generation. But that's all it would take. So, up until today, blatant racism, in-your-face racism, has been accepted. The language we use has changed, but the beliefs and the attitudes are still there. Which is why, as the great Motown singer Smokey Robinson said, Smokey, who, by the way, still looks the same today. There's a picture in his attic that is aging really bad. He made a deal with the devil. When I was a kid, he was a grown-up. He still looks like that to me. And it's still recorded. But one of his famous songs, he said, "If you look closer, it's easy to trace the tracks of my tears." And that's for every black person in America. The tracks of our tears. They've changed the language. They've changed it to be less offensive, less in your face. But it's still there. What's at stake? Everything. As James Baldwin has written, for God gave Noah the rainbow sign and said, "No more water, but fire next time." Thank you.
Before I start asking questions of the panel, I wanted to explore whether or not there were any students who had questions. I know that some of us have class at 1:15. Are there any students who wanted to pose questions now? Yes.
I had a question about you guys' thoughts on reparations, which we know is not a new topic. I mean, immediately after emancipation, slaves were asking for, atonement or some form of compensation. We also know that Congress has, in the past, been willing to give reparations to other ethnic and racial groups. I mean, the Alaskan settlement claim of 71, I believe.
Japanese.
And then we had the Japanese internment after World War II. I think they all got $20,000 each. So, seeing as we have two great examples of how reparations could look, why do you think that Congress has been unwilling to offer reparations to descendants of the slaves or people who were victims of Jim Crow laws?
Well, let me take a shot. In order for Congress to engage in any kind of reparations for the survivors of slavery, they'd have to acknowledge the truth about the horrors and the brutalities and the inhumanities. They don't want to do that. They don't want to acknowledge that. But from my perspective, those people who talk about checks, that's all wrong. How are we going to figure out how much to pay and who to pay? Right? No checks, no money. Reparations should be in the form of what we were denied. Opportunities, freedom. How about money from the federal government to start businesses in the black community? How about money from the federal government to upgrade the schools in the black community? How about money from the federal government to increase black participation in graduate schools? People in medical schools still believe this stuff. They took a survey recently. 40% of second-year medical students today think that blacks don't feel pain the way that white people do. So when black people complain of pain in the hospital, they're not believed. They're not believed. Wanda Sykes, the comedian, had a double mastectomy. And what did they give her when she went home from a double mastectomy? What does she call it? She called it ibuprofen. The white women got opiates. But they gave her aspirin. You don't feel pain the way we do. We've been deprived of opportunities through education and economics. That's what reparations should do. Restore us to the economic, educational position we would have been in had that not happened. No checks. Empowerment. Support. Economically, educationally. That's what we should want. And that's what the reparations form should be all about.
Do you think there's a legal argument for reparations?
Do I think there's a legal argument for reparations? Absolutely. There's a legal argument for reparations. It's a torts argument. If you are damaged, then you get to sue. to be restored for the damages. You run over somebody in your car, or you're just approaching an intersection and the car is out of control, and there's a guy walking across the street with a lunch pail in his hand, and there's a kid walking across the street with a violin box case in his hand. Who do you want to hit? You want to hit the guy with the lunch pail, because you're going to have to restore him. You're going to have to pay for his lost wages with a loss of consortium. But this kid with the violin case, he could be a virtuoso and go on to make millions of dollars as a violinist in his career. That's going to be serious bucks. You damage someone, you must pay them for the damages. How do we measure that in money, in dollars and cents? Very difficult. And that's their opposition. How do we measure? What do we pay? No. Don't pay people. Give us what we lost. Opportunities, education, politically, economically, medically. Give us those opportunities. That's what you took. That's what we want.
So the U.S. Congress in June of 2019 just held the first congressional hearings on reparations after a decade, and they were attended by a number of high-ranking senators and congressmen. And also, just recently, the city of Evanston, Chicago suburb, its city council just voted unanimously to form a subcommittee to work with the legal department to give reparations to African Americans living in Evanston in response to slavery and decades of housing discrimination and other types of oppression. So there are some proceedings and municipalities around the country who are taking it within themselves to address the reparations question.
Well, let me just correct you for a second. The Congress is not having hearings about reparations. They're having hearings about appointing a committee to study. They don't even want to study. This is not about should we give reparations or not and what form should it be in. It's should we have a committee to study this, to decide what we should do. And they're opposed to that. They don't even want to acknowledge it. They don't even want to do it, much less study it.
Yeah, I won't get into the semantics thing, but I would say that's a hearing on reparations, whether or not you start. This is the same thing that the city of Evanston did. They voted unanimously to form the subcommittee to study it, right? But it starts. Some people would say it starts somewhere, and we all have different opinions as to where you should start. You know, I saw some other hands, and that's a good observation. Yes, ma'am.
My question is for Professor Rhodes mostly. Do you think that the United States would benefit from something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Do you think that would be like kind of what Professor Rhodes was saying about like a committee, but I can, yeah.
Well, I think, yes, the whole notion of restorative justice and truth and reconciliation has worked to some extent in the South African instance, and it happens on the ground in communities, even right here in Chicago. The challenge is, going back to Professor Hunt's argument, is that you have to have a critical mass of people in power who are willing to recognize the need and the necessity. To have truth and reconciliation means, in fact, truth, right? It means a recognition of harm. And we still have a political culture, and it's been exacerbated in the recent past, that does not recognize fundamental harm for African Americans. And so that, I think, is one of the sort of critical issues. There is a widespread belief that, and it's rooted in our ideas of meritocracy and individuality and all kinds of other sort of mythologies, that, slavery as an institution didn't matter because individual black people have succeeded despite it, right? The election of Barack Obama did more to sort of to harm that narrative of need and harm by saying, well, if he can make it, anyone can make it, correct? So I think it's about political culture and it's about will, and we're very far away from that recognition. And there's a fundamental resistance to that in many quarters. And I would just add that part of the resistance to reparations is purely economic, right? And you know, as long as black people are constructed as the undeserving in many regards, no one is going to be willing to sort of make even a token expenditure for reparations. Truth and reconciliation, the good thing about that as a methodology is that it doesn't necessarily require a financial payment or investment. But it does require people coming to the table with a level of openness. I'll stop there.
This is to either of the four or all. When Professor Schwinn was talking about black codes and just the way that the Constitution is composed, and Professor Hunt was talking about empowerment, what do you all think about our city? Like you're talking about Evanston, but what about our city that still practices red money in a consistent manner? Even to celebrities with millions of dollars, they can buy homes with cash and are not allowed to purchase homes in Bridgeport. Like, what is the solution? If it's not reparations, then what is the solution to help those of us who are here in this city that are still in a way living under a black code?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. You know, if you think about patterns of housing segregation in a place like Chicago and all the evils that flow from that, there are a lot of contributing forces. Many of those trace directly back to the government, to corporate decisions, even to things as, you know, that we think of as mundane as where to locate public transportation stops, right? I mean, that has a lot to do with choices that we're making about how to build out a city and how to do it in a kind of segregated way. And I think the first step to addressing a problem like residential segregation, and again, I don't, that's a problem in and of itself, but it comes with so much more, right? There are folks at UIC that are doing some awesome work on health outcomes by zip code, which we know correlate highly with race, right? And what we're discovering is that you've got shocking wealth disparities, shocking income disparities, shocking access disparities, and all that translates into shocking health outcome disparities, so much so that you have life expectancies that are measurably and importantly different across racially identified zip codes in a place like the city of Chicago. That's a huge problem. A long-winded way of saying it's not just racial segregation, that's bad enough, but there's a lot more that comes with it. But I think the first step is to understand that is the product of a lot of historical forces that led to that point, including slavery, and to acknowledge that and to try to figure those problems out a little bit so that we can start to address them either through truth and reconciliation or reparations or some other sort of, think of it, I'll use air quotes, kind of affirmative action writ large kind of program to undo the evil effects of prior policy decisions that we've made over time that contribute to that.
So let me just say one thing. Some of us have class at 1:15. And the recording is going to stop at 1:15. We're about a minute away. So I'm going to have to step out. But I want to thank Professor Rhodes for joining us today, as well as Professor Schwinn and Professor Hunt. And I'm going to leave it to you all to feel free to continue with your discussion for a couple more minutes, okay? But we really don't have time, so someone else will have this through. And you wanted to say something, and then I know you had your hand up, so we could just keep it to 30 seconds. We'll be good. Yes?
Yeah, just simple answer. Chicago is the most segregated city in America. Okay? After the predatory lending scandal in which they stole and foreclosed all these houses of black people, that hit Chicago hard. And this was the height of those foreclosures. Chicago is a fundamentally racist city. The South Side and the West Side were created intentionally by the government with racially restrictive codes and zoning, et cetera, to push black people out of Chicago and into these zones, right? That's why, in order to undo it, we need to get the opportunities. This is the federal government doing. Even without the money, federal government has to acknowledge its own participation, its own complicity, and try to undo that. And that does not necessarily mean money.
Okay. Can you do it in 10 seconds?